citizens are more supportive of what are called sufficiency policies, and they're much more willing to support regulation than governments are. So we can see that citizens are, I think, more willing to deal with the crisis than our existing political institutions.
To me, the most persuasive argument for democratic innovations is the Trojan horse kind of metaphor. You get inside the system and create new openings from the inside and transform it from the inside.
Welcome to Democratic Innovations, the podcast series where we explore how democratic innovations are reshaping the landscape of citizen participation in response to the ongoing crisis in representative democracy. I am Roberto Falanga, researcher at the University of Lisbon, and I'll be your host. In this third episode, we're focusing on the pathways of democratic innovations through the multiple crises that challenge our democracies, starting from the crisis of democracy itself. Do democratic innovations have the capacity to deal with ongoing disrupting changes, such as those brought about by the climate crisis? And how are democratic innovations surfing the digital transition and the ascent of artificial intelligence? Finally, what can democratic innovations do in the face of spreading political crises and conflicts around the globe? To guide us through this subject, we are fortunate to have Professor Graham Smith and Professor Oliver Escobar. Graham Smith is Professor of Politics at the Center for the Study of Democracy in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Westminster, and he is also the founding chair of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, KNOCA. Oliver Escobar is Professor of Public Policy and Democratic Innovation at the University of Edinburgh. Together with them, we will dive into the role of democratic innovations in a rapidly changing world. In particular, we will interrogate the alleged success of climate assemblies in tandem with political efforts before the climate emergency. We will also discuss the success of new technologies applied to democratic systems and their impact on citizen participation. Conflicts around the globe will help us focus on the contribution of democratic innovations to political change beyond the sought policy improvement. There is no crisis that can elude change. But change does not necessarily mean disaster, and democratic innovations have the capacity to make seeds of hope grow. So, let's start. The original meaning of crisis in Greek and Latin languages was that of separation from one status to another. For example, the separation from a condition of illness to a condition of well-being. The word per se did not necessarily hold a negative meaning, and it rather portrayed the dividing line between a time before and after. However, what we currently understand as a crisis is the downfall from an alleged ideal social condition. Think of the alarm generated by the financial crisis that erupted a decade ago. There, some of us questioned for a short time the neoliberal global market, whose dominance has continued straightforward though. Think of the recent health crisis precipitated by the pandemic, which turned our lives upside down for months, if not years, and we seemed to have lost the world as we knew it, oscillating between despair and the dream of a better world. Yet, we eventually restored the world as it was, and to some extent, we made it even worse. So, if democratic innovations are to face the crisis of democracy, understood as a change from a condition A to a condition B, we would like to understand with you if this is a realistic goal. And to do that, we will look at some ramifications of that crisis, such as the climate crisis, the emerging crisis stemming from socioeconomic inequalities in the face of new technologies and tech companies, and also the severe political crisis breaking through current conflicts worldwide. So let's start from the climate crisis. You both acknowledge the potential of democratic innovations for sustainable solutions, broadly speaking. At the empirical level, there is a growing debate on the climate crisis that can be taken as a positive signal, too. Think of the spread of movements claiming for climate justice, as well as the COPs and related political promises on sustainability. And then, of course, the rampant role of climate assemblies. Since you both investigate and collaborate with climate assemblies, I would like to kick off this conversation by asking, where do we stand today with such practices? What tangible gains can you associate with climate assemblies? Um, Graham, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks for inviting us to this discussion. Really critical issues. So, as you mentioned, I'm the chair of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which is funded by the European Climate Foundation. And our role is to try and understand practice and try and help those people who are developing new assemblies or advocates for assemblies to master what they're trying to, master the subject area and try and not make the mistakes of previous people. The first thing I want to say is you talked about the rampant role of climate assemblies. I still think they're very marginal practices, and I think we have to remember that this is a very niche activity. I think if we try and count, roughly we might have seen 100 climate assemblies in the, and that's being very liberal in the use of what we mean by a climate assembly. And that's really not very many. I mean, and most of them are one-off. Many of them are only over a couple of weekends or whatever. There's only been, I would suggest, a handful of really large-scale, well-resourced assemblies across the world. One of which Oliver was involved in Scotland. So I just want to put that down as a marker, because I think sometimes when we read the academic literature and we read some of the policy literature, it's as if these things are happening everywhere all of the time and are making just lots of really important decisions, and that just isn't the case. That said, from those assemblies that have worked well, and we can talk about what it means to work well, it's quite clear that citizens are willing and able to learn, deliberate, and come to robust proposals. And there is now starting to be some really interesting academic evidence showing that citizens are more supportive of what are called sufficiency policies. These are policies where we restrict consumption and production of products and services. They're much more willing to support that kind of action than governments are. And they're much more willing to support regulation than governments are. So we can see that citizens are, I think, more willing to deal with the crisis than our existing political institutions. We have seen some policy shifts. We have seen some institutional shifts. We've seen some large-scale public debates around assemblies, and we've seen really significant effects on the attitudes and behaviours of participants. But I still want to stress this is in the basis of a very marginal practice. We can look at assemblies and say they are really interesting spaces, really interesting political spaces, but and they have had impacts, even though they've been marginal. But there's more to come. I don't know if how Oliver feels. Is that a fair summary, do you think, Oliver? Or yeah?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with everything you've said there, and I guess I'm kind of tempted to also to take a step back first, and I'll come back to the issue of climate assemblies. But I like how Roberto started from this definition of crisis, and one of the really interesting things about crisis is that there are moments of liminality, right? Mm-hmm. And there's some really interesting work in the anthropological and sociological tradition that shows how liminal spaces, liminal temporalities are either moments or spaces that are no longer the space or the time it was just before, not yet the space or the time is going to be after. There are moments of transition. And in that sense, what's interesting about that is that they are windows of opportunity for change. So to me, all these crises are obviously, most of them are undesirable and sometimes unavoidable. And if they are going to happen, we need to think very carefully about the change aspect. And what is really clear is that we have a system that is really good at replicating and resuming back to the status quo. And that tells us something about the powerful structural forces that we're contending with. Even after the financial crash, look how quickly we came back to it. We're back into a financial system that is more like gambling and casino banking than anything that serves the real economy. And again, post COVID, which still is a reality for millions of people around the world, and yet it seems that we systemically we haven't learned that much about health governance and the importance of involving citizens in the leadership effort to deal with those crises. So, but there is the possibility of change, and that's where these new civic institutions, these democratic innovations, I think, have a role to play. And when it comes to the climate crisis, it seems to me that there are two key aspects of that crisis. It's a crisis of imagination, and it's a crisis of action. It's a crisis of imagination in terms of the very narrow understanding of political life and economic life and the systems that go behind to support political life and economic life. And we've just built very narrow understandings of how we could live together and how we could organize ourselves as a society, as an economy, as a democracy, etc. So it's a crisis of imagination. And it's a crisis of action because clearly we are really challenged in terms of the capacity to tackle many of the challenges that are packed into this mega confluence of crises that we call the climate crisis. So the question is, can democratic imaginations address that double crisis of imagination and action? And I'm an optimist on this. I think they are part. Let's remember that the field of democratic innovation is much wider, and that there are many other new processes and institutions, but climate assemblies have a clear role to play. And I think there has been progress with climate assemblies, but it's very early days, as Graham is saying. And the scale and the scope is yet insufficient. It couldn't be otherwise. It would be unrealistic. Let's remember that although contemporary citizens' assemblies, as we define them now, sortition-based and, this kind of mini public assemblies, yeah, they are only 20 years old, but climate assembly is really 5-6 years old. If we include juries and other smaller mini publics, then we could go a little bit far back. But with climate assemblies per se, they are a new phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And the story of climate assemblies is not yet persuasive enough on both accounts, on the imagination account and on the action account. And I think that that's where the work is now going. And there are a lot of people, a lot of communities of practice, communities of interest, communities of activism, communities of research working and pulling together to see how far we can take this.
Thank you both. I actually agree. I mean, we should understand climate assemblies not as a rampant practices, but as new practices that are on the field. I mean, I've been on the field for 5 years, 6 years. So this is a story that is still being written. But if we look at also other democratic innovations, as you just said, Oliver, I mean, my feeling, I mean, which is based on also on the evidence which is shared by scholars, is that these innovations often fall short of providing a consensual response to structural inequalities, and this still makes some difference in bridging the gap between citizens and decision making. What are the most critical barriers that you see today in the pursuit of climate-sensitive solutions and also environmental sustainability, more broadly speaking? So how can citizens actually have a voice considering the structural inequalities of society? Please, Oliver.
Okay, yeah, I'll get going. So, I mean, one of the key barriers, I don't know if this is a barrier or a tension, a particular tension that I see across mainly most of the democratic innovations I'm familiar with through study or practice in the digital space and climate assemblies, participatory budgeting, and then different forms of collaborative governance. And what I see across is a key challenge, which is that challenge of navigating the tension between radical aspirations and pragmatic challenges, right? Navigating the tension between being tamed or co-opted by the status quo versus, or let me put it this way, being transformative rather than reproductive. Right, not just not having democratic innovations as things that help to shore up existing systems that many of us would argue are broken and need reform or even transformation. So navigating that tension takes a lot of political know-how, and we are only beginning to learn. Because if democratic innovations are too embedded in the state, there are clear risks. If they are too far apart from the state, there are clear risks. So you're again back to this notion of the liminal space. In my view, at their best, democratic innovations are a bridge between the streets and the institutions. I ended up working on these things, apart from being inspired by Graham, who's been a great mentor over the years, but I was coming to this from previous work on an interest in social movements, in popular assemblies, in the student movement, etc., etc. And there was always this frustration that a lot of these mobilizations ended up at the doors of some kind of institution where you were just knocking from the outside. So to me, the most persuasive argument for democratic innovations is the Trojan horse kind of metaphor, right? You get inside the system and you try and create new openings from the inside and transform it from the inside. So that is very difficult to do. And I think democratic innovations have been, if we think about the two pillars of democratic governance, on the one hand, legitimacy, on the other hand, capacity. So legitimacy to act and capacity to act. I think democratic innovations have done more on the legitimacy side. That's where they tend to focus. If only we just took better decisions. If only we had better informed policy making. If only we had more citizen engagement in developing public services. Where we still have a lot to do is on the capacity side, which is the impact side, is the side of bureaucracies. It's also the side of the commons and what communities themselves need to do in response to these democratic innovations. And I think that this is one of the most exciting areas for the development of democratic innovations, the democratization of economic life. And some of the work we're doing just now is to very explicitly connect the commons and the space of commoning as that third pillar of society, state, market, and the commons, and how the commons understood through the lens of democratic innovations can help us to make more progress on the capacity side of things, the ways in which we're going to rewire economies, the way we are going to reimagine systems, energy systems, transport systems. And to me, that's pretty exciting. But there are fundamental barriers that have to do with how we have built those systems and the things that need to happen to change them. And, and this comes down to change makers. A lot of my focus is on agents and what people themselves are doing. And there are some really interesting alliances. There's no clear cut here. I know plenty of what I would call internal activists within the state that are trying to make a space for this. There are also plenty of people out there in communities who want to replicate the status quo. So it's a messy space of interesting alliances across some of these traditional divides. But yeah, so to me, key barriers have to do with that, making sure we put as much on the capacity to act side of things as we put on the legitimacy side, and on navigating that tension between being too far or too close, and how do we create that in-between space that is liminal and therefore opens the opportunity for change.
Thank you, Oliver. Graham.
Roberto, I think you're going to be disappointed that Oliver and I are going to say very similar things. We've got to try and find some controversy here. But I guess a couple of thoughts. I guess that I build on what Oliver was saying. Firstly, a comment. You talked about a consensual response to structural inequalities. I don't think we will ever have a consensual response to structural inequalities, but I think this is always going to be an area of contest. And I think this is just a generic problem. I think some people who work on democratic innovations are sort of are trying to take the politics out of democracy, and I think that's deeply problematic. And I think sometimes some of the ways that citizens' assemblies are talked about are as if they're depoliticized spaces. I actually think they're highly political spaces. It's just a different type of politics. But I think we've got a problem on, following on from what Oliver said, a couple of problems. One is that the our state institutions, our public authorities who currently are commissioning assemblies and other democratic innovations, are they actually willing to create the space for assemblies to really deal with systemic and the structural nature of the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, various other health crises, inequality crisis, etc.? Are they willing to create that space? And the argument, my answer in many ways is generally not, because this is a dysfunctional state. So it's really difficult to imagine assemblies really being being commissioned by state and public authorities to really deal with some of those structural conditions. What's interesting is that you can set up an assembly and all sorts of unintended consequences happen. And of course, citizens not bizarrely, but citizens will start asking these difficult questions, and sometimes get closed down, sometimes it gets opened up. So I think there is a real issue here of we are sort of looking to the state very often to commission these bodies, and a state that is deeply implicated in the current crisis. So I think that's one problem we've got. The second is that even if we were in the situation where that these democratic innovations were being empowered to deal with these, to really dig deep into these sort of structural and systemic issues, the extent to which public authorities and other stakeholders, whether they're whichever sector they happen to be in, are willing to follow up on those proposals that come out from citizens. This is going to be a topic for next week, but both Oliver and I are interested in this. I think there's a lot of investment in what we might call the spectacle of citizen engagement, actually organising the citizen engagement. And that's the kind of, for some people, that's the end point. That is it. We've done the citizen engagement. But of course, that's just the start. And this has to then be linked, integrated with other bodies, whether those bodies are of the state or outside the state. I mean, that's the big thing. And so I think people like, and I have to hold my hands up here, and I spent most of my last 25 years thinking about citizen engagement. And I didn't think about landing that engagement. I mean, landing that engagement within the state or within non-state actors, within the commons, however we want to think about that. And I think that's true of most people who have been working in the sector as well. They're given contracts to run the assembly and then deliver a report. And who's doing that? And these are the people that Oliver's talking about. Who's doing that work of translation, of translating what's happening within a deliberative space into these other spaces? And I think that's the really exciting bit. And one of the critical barriers is there aren't enough of those people. And those people who are in that space are not resourced to do that work and are not encouraged to do that work. So I think there's a really interesting group of activists who are within the state and outside the state who we need to empower to be able to, if you like, for want of a simple word, if you like, to link these spaces of citizen participation with other institutional forms. And I think it's also really interesting, and Oliver will have come across this as well, is that really hardcore climate and social justice activists are really interested in the power of things like assemblies, but the way they envisage them are really as counterpowers, as countervailing powers against the state, and are wanting to create these, if you like, civic institutions that are apart from the state and are challenging the state. I think most of us, this is something which I see, myself as being problematic in the way I've been thinking about this. I think for a lot of us, the end goal of democratic innovations was getting the state to commission them. And I think that's not a mistake. I want to see the state commission these things, and all sorts of interesting things can happen. But that kind of was the teleology. That was the way we were thinking of that was the end goal. But actually, I think there's going to be all sorts of different practices emerge here. And I'm really interested in how some of these social movements, and not just social movements, we've recently in the UK had what I would classify as three quite conservative conservation organisations organise what they called a people's assembly, a citizens' assembly on nature. And they created a people's plan for nature, which is part of civil society advocacy. Now, that's not the model that most of us were working with. And now we're also seeing activists, XXR activists, people out some of the other social movements, thinking about how do we create these spaces beyond explicitly contesting state power. I think that this is really fascinating. And I think a lot of the ways we've been thinking about democratic innovations have to be really challenged and sort of make. I mean, for me, it's incredibly exciting. I actually think that this idea of of of, of multiple different points within society where these innovations could intervene is really fabulous. And I think we, as academics and as people working on this area, have really got to sort of get away from a particular vision that I think most of us have been carrying. I think we've got a particular mental model that we really need to abandon.
If I may, Roberto, just to build on that quickly, because the Scottish Climate Assembly is a good example of this. There are many of the recommendations clearly point to the state to act, and and we are in the aftermath, and we are trying to get that accountability going, but it is difficult. But many of the recommendations point to other spaces. In Scotland, for example, we have something like the Scottish Climate Communities Network, which is a really large network of people in communities across the geography of Scotland doing all kinds of things on energy, on transport, on community-owned wind turbines, on all kinds of community-owned assets, and on housing, etc., etc. So all the big ticket items for climate action. And I think that we just need to get much better at tapping into those networks and that capacity, because, and we can get into the debate of the size of the state and what it cannot do in terms of the shape of the contemporary state. But in many countries, the reality is that we're not going to be able to wait for the state to be what it was just after the Second World War, that kind of incredibly powerful machinery to build welfare states. We're not in that situation just now. But also, a lot of this goes to a classic space that we understand really well in critical policy studies, which is the implementation gap. And that's why you need to get into some stuff that is not as sexy as a climate assembly, right? Things like bureaucracy, right? Things like how bureaucracy works, how public administration works and should work, right? And the work of public officials, the work of organizers and facilitators who are in between states and communities. And that space, is a really difficult space to be in. We've done research on this to show the burnout of what it takes to be an internal activist within those institutions, and how over time you can really get demoralized and constrained unless there's a critical mass. So you go from a critical mass of people here and there to alliances that build a critical mass that begin to create momentum. And that's why we see the advance of democratic innovations in some institutions and not in others, is when that critical mass emerges from that critical mass. But just a final point. So I'm suspicious of this rush to dismiss democratic innovations when we have been cutting so much slack to dominant imaginaries of democracy for a long time, in some places for centuries. And so we need to cut some slack to these new imaginaries and at least let them take shape and let us learn as we go before dismissing things and putting pressure on the people who are trying to navigate these very difficult tensions.
Yeah.
I really like this. I really like this, through the critical mass to the critical mass. And let me.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. You can always guarantee Oliver will have a couple of those every time you talk to him. Actually, just on that, you see, that's in some ways the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, KNOCA tries to play that role of there are so many people out there who individually are committed to assemblies and they don't know other people, and that's just simply having a space where regularly peers can get together and learn lessons from each other, but just hear that someone else is working on things like they're working on. And we underestimate the power of those sorts of connections because a lot of these actors are really isolated.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you now a question which I think, I mean, it has to do also with the multiplication of entry points of this critical mass or critical mass, which has to do with the digital transition, which is, I guess we all agree, it is an unprecedented change in contemporary society. So, along with the positives of digitalization, ethical concerns arise as it's uncontrolled and uncontrollable, it seems, development. Think of the current debate in Europe, for example, on the regulation of AI. shall we expect a technology-based crisis at some point in the future? And do you see the preparation somehow of some dystopian battleground between machines and humans? And and what the role of democratic innovations in all that?
that's a quite a question, but I just happened to be reading. I don't know if you've come across this author, a woman called Becky Chambers. She writes Solar Punk, which is a kind of sci-fi based on there has been a collapse, and then it's kind of reconstituting society using renewables, etc. And this book is actually about how I really like it. There's obviously been some sort of, sorry, I'm taking you in a very strange direction here. There's been a sort of technological crisis. The robots have gained consciousness. The people have realized that they're exploiting this conscious being. And what they've done is they split the world in half. And the robots have gone to live in this half of the world which has been rewilded. And the humans have sort of tried to bring start their society again elsewhere. And then after a few, it's not clear how long, but after a century or so, the one of the robots has come out to see how the humans have got on, and it's all about that relationship. So I can tell you a lot now about the post-crisis. I'm not sure I can tell you about what happened in that
within the crisis.
Yeah. But I mean, this is such a big question. Is there going to be a technology-based crisis? I kind of think we're in one, and that's to do with things like the way that technology is generating polarization. This is regardless of AI. This is, although it's clearly algorithms that are part of this. So I kind of feel that we are in a political stroke technological crisis in those terms already, and we're desperately trying to navigate that. And so. I'm not sure it's necessarily a dystopian battleground between machines and society. It's sort of it's all integrated together. I mean, the point here is that we are sort of. I mean, look at what we're doing now. We're sort of almost cyborgs already. In the way that we're using Zoom, etc. So, I mean, that deep implication of humans and machines is already with us. And parts of it are causing all sorts of problems. Other parts of it are causing all sorts of really interesting benefits. So do I see a role in democratic innovations in this? Whenever I see a political conflict, I see a role for democratic innovation. So yes is the answer. And the interesting question is, but again, how much should we expect of democratic innovations in this space? I think there's a real danger that, Oliver's named this explicitly already, of us assuming that democratic innovations, because they're we've spotted this really new shiny object, it's going to be the nice thing, it's going to be the one stop, the pill that's going to sort everything out. And I think that's our problem. So for me, obviously, from what I've seen from the sort of the way that democratic innovations enable agency, enable creativity, enable imagination, and potentially enable action, then yes is the answer. Of course, democratic innovations could have a role to play. Are they going to have a role to play when we think about how much capital is being driven, is driving this? Are they going to be really, this sort of running an assembly in the face of all of this, or running a particular innovation? So I'm one of these people who I don't have a kind of vision for what democratic innovation and participatory and deliberative democracy is going to deliver. What I know is that it's one of those few games in town at the moment where there is creativity, where there is imagination, where it is providing people with agency. I've got no idea what what it will look like in even a year's time. If you'd asked me 4 years' time, would there be this many climate assemblies, I would have said, oh no, clearly there won't be. So I'm not going. I just don't know what the future holds. But what I am pleased to see is that we have seen these technologies, these participatory technologies. We've got a sense of what they can do, and they are a resource and a way of doing things and a way of being together that may or may not allow us to help navigate some of these crises. We're in a better place for them being around than we would be if they weren't there.
What about you, Oliver?
Yeah, well, I agree with Graham on something fundamental, which is that technologically mediated crisis is already here, and it's again a poly crisis, a confluence of crises. I mean, at the most basic level, some of the best known elements are, the development of killer robots that are already playing havoc in all kinds of military spaces and war zones. You have, the rise of surveillance capitalism, where the commodification of data and everything that is happening backstage, and this is another. Earlier we were mentioning the politics of imagination. The other key area is the politics of visibility and invisibility, the things that we are seeing and that enter the radar and therefore become matters of public concern, which then can be addressed, at least in theory, because they have become visible, and all the things that are invisible. And a lot of this politics of visibility and invisibility has to do with a very old debate in the formation of the digital public sphere. This was there since the 90s. Manuel Castells already pointed out that, things could go in the way of, is this about creating new highways for corporate interests or a myriad pathways for new community initiatives and ways of organizing? And we are still in that battle. Is this going to be a corporate digital public sphere, or is it going to be a digital commons? And that battle is being fought every day by myriad players. And even just today, the news that Microsoft has hired the former
CEO,
executives from OpenAI, and now all of that is going into a purely for-profit space. That shows you these battlefields and how these front lines are being drawn. So there's a lot in there, but it boils down to some of these basic, a lot of this has to do, just contrast, for example, some of the efforts that are being taken towards developing democratic innovations for collective intelligence, versus, for example, the meeting last week or a couple of weeks ago in the UK with leaders and a top-down elitist understanding of AI governance. That's again is the battle between collective intelligence versus elitism, a battle that was also there during the pandemic, and elitism won, with some exceptions, Taiwan being one of them. And that's something that we are going to keep sort of struggling with as we go. The bit I'm really excited about is about the what AI, for example, can do for scalability. And one of my students, Sami Makine, is doing work on 17 different applications that artificial intelligence can have within citizens' assemblies to do all kinds of interesting things that at the moment we're very limited in doing, in terms of processing large amounts of data, improving deliberative quality through devil's advocate functions, the ability to craft all kinds of collective narratives, the ability to have prompts to help human facilitators, all kinds of things on sortition and how that could be done better, all kinds of things on dissemination and impact, policy readiness. So there's a lot of potential at that technical level, but at the level of one thing is technology for democratic innovation. I think that's a really interesting space and a lot of potential. Another thing is whether democratic innovations can contribute to the governance of these cutting-edge technologies. And on that side, that's where we are much more susceptible to these bigger forces and older battles in the political economy of the digital public sphere. But again, because the relationship between democratic innovations and crisis also goes the other way around. Sometimes crisis can be catalysts for democratic innovations. And in many places, that has been part of the origin story of democratic innovations. Think about Iceland, for example, right? The financial crash, and then the early interesting systemic democratic innovations. And, actually, some people go as far as to say that this is the argument that Roberto Mangabeira Unger makes, that we have become addicted to change through crisis. We can only change when we crash. And it seems that our societies and our political systems have become just so dependent on crisis as the catalyst for change. And that's very unhealthy, but that's where we seem to be. And, on a less optimistic take, we might find ourselves in this strange predicament of having democratic innovations helping us to work our way towards a better end of the world.
Cheerful.
Graham was mentioning that book. There are books now. There's a whole body of literature that is emerging on how to accomplish a better end of the world.
Yeah.
And now, and there's something really daunting and problematic about that assumption, because it can paralyze us and lead to this defeatist type of, which I really am not into at all. But there is something really fundamental about how democratic innovations are going to be tested over the next 10, 20, 30 years with the multiplicity of crises we're going to be facing. And that's where we really need democratic innovations to be much more advanced in terms of their embeddedness in institutional systems and how those systems need to change so that they become more like a democracy than what they are at the moment.
Oliver, I think you need to read some Solarpunk to cheer yourself up.
I will. So my Christmas reading list.
Let me keep a couple of minutes again on the digital transition. I have a question which is related to the previous one, but it's more, let's say, more practical and more focused on democratic innovations, which has to do with the use of digital platforms, which has been very much a case in point for democratic innovations in the last at least in the last decade. However, researchers are still struggling to make sense of whether the digital should be considered as a mere instrument or a new empirical reality. And so I would like to ask you if digital democratic innovations that are gaming life at the point that, to me, maybe should be considered as a new typology. But I would like to hear from you whether how do we somehow categorize the digital within the field of study of democratic innovations? Is it still an instrument or not?
So let me offer a provocation, maybe, because this might be, this is going to get a little bit niche in here, because this is about how, obviously, Graham has produced the 2009 book on democratic innovations that in many ways kind of galvanized the field. And then 10 years later, we put together the handbook with the help of Graham and many others, to try and take the pulse of the field and see how it had evolved in those 10 years. And in the initial book by Graham, digital democratic innovations are a category on their own right. When we were doing our own analysis and looking at how people have been working on these things, we ended up concluding that we couldn't categorize it as a distinctive democratic innovation, because we saw it as a factor that created all kinds of hybrids. So you could have digital participatory budgeting, you could have all forms of forums of digital collaborative governance, you can have all kinds of crowdsourcing, crowd mapping in the way in which citizen initiatives and referenda, and the same kind of aggregative logic. So we saw it as a hybridizing factor, if that's a word.
Did you change your mind, Oliver?
Well, we are rethinking some of this stuff, but not quite changing our mind, because I don't see yet something that you could point out as the core defining feature of a digital democratic innovation, besides the fact that it's underpinned by some kind of digital infrastructure. And that's not a core quality that is only exclusive to digital democratic innovations. So we are still where we were. I don't know how Graham feels about that change we made to his typology.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily made a change to my typology. It's just I didn't know what to do with digital innovation. So I think,
honest.
No, but it's honest. If you think the book was published in 2009, which, given it was of Cambridge, that took a long time. So it was actually written in, finished in 2008, which meant most of the research for it was done in 2006, 2007. There wasn't actually that much there, and then most of it was very experimental. So it's been really hard to think, to diagnose how to talk about it. And I think I would probably follow Oliver now, which is that there for me, and that was the kind of intention behind the book. There was different logics between different families of democratic innovation. And I think those logics are also true of digital formations. It's just that, or even hybrid formations. I think most digital are actually hybrid anyway, because we don't need to talk about that necessarily. But I don't think there is this at the moment. I don't see any need for a separate category. It's about being more nuanced in the way that we understand different participatory, deliberative, contestatory logics, and making sure that we place them in that. I think for me, at the moment, and you've got to remember, sorry, this is the guy who couldn't log on to the platform that we're talking on now. So I'm the last person you should be talking about this. But I'm actually still quite disappointed about what it. So if there's a huge promise of democratic innovations, I think digital innovations have overpromised. Even more than the sort of than the more sort of face-to-face versions of innovation. So, the niche there, I think, is an incredible amount of promise and hype, and a lack of delivery. But of course, we're not at the end of the road of that either. And I think a lot of that, again, is as Oliver pointed out. Think about the amount of resources that are going into this compared to almost everything else that's going on, around the digital. I think for me, a couple of thoughts. One is that when the pandemic hit, it was a real opportunity for people working in our field to really try and embrace some of this technological development. And I think what happened is that the research that we've done is that in my field around citizens' assemblies, is that most of the practitioners tried as hard to carry on as much as they could using technology that made it look a bit like what they did before. So everybody went on to Zoom, because Zoom allowed you to see people face to face. It had breakout groups that looks a bit like small table work. They were trying to recreate the patterns of practice. And I think so. There's a problem from my community, which is we look to technology to help us do the things we already do, rather than thinking, oh, could we do things differently, and what would it mean to do things differently? I also think there's a problem from civic tech, the people working in that area who don't necessarily get some of the democratic ideals and practices that we find important. So the amount of times I've had conversations with somebody, and you must get these all the time, Oliver, someone emailing you saying, I've just created an app that's going to solve all of democracy's problems. I get someone like, and it's usually an engineer of some description. It's usually someone who knows very little about politics or society, but has said, I've got this thing. And usually the thing, when you say, but so there'll be some really interesting interaction on these on these designs, but no account of how who's actually participating on these things. So I think one of the things that digital developers have done very well is create some really interesting spaces, but they still haven't helped us with this problem about who populates those spaces, who's coming into those spaces. So I think there's a real problem there, and I think there's a real lack of creative dialogue between those people who are working in deliberative and participatory democracy, whether they are practitioners working on state-based, state commission processes, or even more civil society actors, and people working in civic tech. And I think that for me, the pandemic showed that conversation was even worse than I thought it had been, because people just weren't ready to share practices. So in a sense, that was a real test case for me as to whether anything really exciting would emerge. And I don't personally, no one's really pointed out much to me. I think there's some really interesting stuff, but nothing game changing. And I thought, isn't that moment when you thought that might happen? And I absolutely understand why people try to hold on to what was familiar and try to find those technologies would allow them to do familiar things. But I also think it was a slight missed opportunity.
If I can, Roberto, just super quick, because just a final thought on the case I keep coming back to on digital democratic innovations is the case of Taiwan, virtual Taiwan, right? And this is the case I always tend to have in mind because it has become quite well known, and and there's a lot of hype around it sometimes, and some really clear impact that it had during the pandemic, for example. But if you look at it, you couldn't define it as a digital democratic innovation. You could define it as a system that gathers a range of democratic innovations, like Polis, which essentially is not necessarily a democratic innovation, but it's a crowdsourcing platform of a particular kind. But then it's combined with all these other things, face-to-face meetings, televised forums, stuff that you do through Slack or other kind of group work tech. So in a sense, maybe at the systemic level, when you have something like V-Taiwan, you could think of that as a form of digital democratic innovation infrastructure. But it's not one process. It's 20 different platforms combined in a governance process that mediates between communities of place, practice, interest, identity, etc., and the state. So again, this just illustrates how difficult it is to think of digital processes or digital institutions, if that could be a thing, as democratic innovations per se.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Graham. Let me now ask you the very last question. I hope you don't find it too hard to answer because,
Sorry, can I just check? Were your other questions supposed to be easy?
Well, well, actually, the last question is really about political crisis, and actually, the political crisis induced by the conflicts worldwide. So, if democratic innovations are to empower citizens towards, tangible changes, I would say policy changes, shall we expect more from them? Shall we expect also political change as a goal of democratic innovation? And then again, the question is whether this is a realistic goal for democratic innovation. So, yeah, the question is whether participatory and deliberative processes can raise political awareness in a context like the context we live in, where we are surrounded by spreading conflicts and wars.
Again, thinking about your question, I think that generally, but not always, but generally, democratic innovations are political activity. It is political activity. It is. You are engaging in political change by organising democratic innovation. So, they may be aimed at most of them aimed at policy change, but even there, many of them are actually suggesting political change. But the very act of enacting democratic innovations is political. It's highly political. And I think the kinds of choices that are made when we see what democratic innovations are embedded by particular agencies gives us a sense of how much they're willing to open up that political space or not. And it's really important, as I said before, democratic innovations may often be there may be a certain logic and motivation behind them on the part of the commissioner, but that isn't necessarily what happens. There's all sorts of unintended and very interesting impact. So in that sense, I think it's a deeply political field. I think that, and this reflects back. I started talking about the pandemic, and one of the really interesting things about the pandemic was, and Oliver pointed this out. Mostly, it was a very centralized response, and we've now got the inquiry into the COVID inquiry going on in the UK. And what's really interesting about that is how the people at the centre of that, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are recognising that was deeply problematic. It meant they didn't hear a diversity of voices. It meant that you had, for example, people who had all gone to private school, which in the UK means you pay for your children to go to school, making decisions about whether or not people should have free school meals. Someone who'd no one in the room had ever had a free school meal, and yet they're making decisions about that. So lots of those sorts of things are happening. And I did a book with some colleagues involved called Democracy in a Pandemic, which Oliver was very kind to review. And it was a whole series of blogs that were written by people during the pandemic. And a lot of them were making the 2 points were being made. And these were mostly activists, and very often activists from marginal and marginalized communities. And we're making the point that government was all of a sudden asking them to inverted commas help or engage with the community when they hadn't been before the crisis, and that suddenly they were trying to do this. And of course, it just doesn't work. And those places that were reasonably successful at responding, doing community based responses were those places which actually had built civic infrastructure before the crisis happened. So I think there's something really important here. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the danger is we try and build this infrastructure during and in response to crisis. And I think it's important to try to do that. But if we're not building stuff, and we are in crisis already, but if we're not purposefully building things in advance of breakdown conditions, then it's not a surprise when breakdown conditions hit that democratic innovations don't necessarily work. So for me, this is about building, there's a real point here, and it's a real political point, that we need to be building civic infrastructure. And when I say we, I don't necessarily mean the state. The state needs to build civic infrastructure. It needs to invest in it. It needs to resource it, because we don't resource our democracies. We don't support our democracies.
It's a great platform to now just say the final 2-3 points I want to make on this. Because, I mean, the example of the pandemic is really good as well, because it allows us to see, in Scotland, for example, some of the most effective action was community-led action, because it was a distributed system of intelligence and capacity. So community-anchored organizations, these are things like community-controlled housing associations, community-owned energy projects, all kinds of community-led assets across Scotland, which is really powerful in that kind of commons infrastructure. These were the front lines. This is where things were accomplished that the state couldn't accomplish. The centralized state. Remember, the state in the UK and the devolved nations like Scotland is one of the most centralized systems of governance in the world. So it has very limited capacity to grapple with complexity, so that is crucial. But also, I mean, it was incredible. They set up an app for volunteering in the UK, and it crashed as soon as it was put out, because there were over 700,000 people who were, so the space of mutualism, etc. That space is still under what's the word I'm looking for? Not underdeveloped, but just not yet properly connected to the space of democratic innovation as it should be. And then you ask about moments of the political focus versus the policy focus. The thing is, I mean, we know that when it comes to constitutional moments and constitutional processes, democratic innovations can do quite well at that, because they are about things like citizens' assemblies in the context of developing the Icelandic constitution or similar kind of initiatives in that space. They are about overarching values, about first principles, about shared priorities, rather than the more challenging space of policy and action and the implementation gap. So on that kind of situation of political crisis and constitutional moments, I think democratic innovations can do quite well. But for me, and I think this is the point I want to finish on, I think we need to start focusing even more in this field on the crisis that underpins all other crises. In health studies, they have this concept of the fundamental causes of health inequalities, right? The fundamental causes are those that sit behind the apparent causes of the troubles we face. And for me, the fundamental cause in this field is power inequalities. I see all other inequalities and most of the troubles we face across all these other crises as underpinned by a crisis of political inequality, of inequalities in power, how power is distributed and exercised. This is the reason I ended up working in this field, because I started doing research on poverty and social exclusion in Galicia, which is where I'm from, not far from Portugal. I started by looking at different policy areas that affected poverty and social exclusion: housing, energy, transport, social security, etc. And what I realized is that all of them had something in common, which was flawed decision-making processes. Political inequalities built at the heart of the governance systems that have been built for all those different policy areas, which is why I didn't end up working on a specific policy area. I ended up interested in the processes that underpin all these different policy areas, and process as an underlying dimension of all these things. There's a joke that we tell in Galicia, in Spain, which is, there's this man who goes to the doctor and says to the doctor, look, I have pain in all these different places in my body. And the doctor, she's kind of curious, and she begins to say, well, okay, so show me where. And the guy goes with his finger, touches in the head and says, look, I have pain in my head. Touches in the shoulder and say, oh, my shoulder hurts. But if I touch my foot hurts as well. Of course, the doctor says, well, what's hurting you there? What's broken is the finger. Right? Is the underlying cause. It's not all the other symptoms that appear. So for me, power inequalities are that finger. Is the thing that kind of touches everything. So if we are talking about the underlying crisis that underpins all these other crises, crisis of collective imagination, of collective action, of power inequalities, I think the field of democratic innovation needs to have a stronger political economy angle to everything we're doing, recognizing that democratic innovation needs to be joined up with social innovation, with economic innovation, and also begin to think more carefully and more deeply. And we haven't, this is another debate and another podcast, why we haven't done this more, but think more carefully and more purposefully about the economic foundations of political life, and realizing that the economy and politics cannot be separated. And unfortunately, so far, the field of democratic innovation keeps the field of the economy and democratizing the economy quite separate from the field of democratizing our politics. So we need to join those two. This is a well-known space in democratic thinking where you cannot separate those spheres of life, because democratic life is underpinned by economic life. So I'm just hoping, and I think there are people, more and more people now working on this, a political economy of democratic innovation, how democratic innovations in workplaces, in neighborhoods, in institutions, in the state, outside the state, how they all can begin to rewire the systems we have. Something, I can't remember who came up with this, but as a form of social acupuncture, where you have a million little pings in all the right places, and as a whole, it might produce an effect in the body politic that helps us to open the space for change.
Thank you, Graham and Oliver, and thank you all for joining us in the third episode of Democratic Innovations. In the next episode, we'll host Stephen Helstab and Ricky Dean. With them, we'll discuss the role of democratic innovations in changing public administration. Do they ease the burden of bureaucracy, or do they get trapped within the complex and multi-level machinery of governance? So, stay tuned. This podcast is sponsored by the EU-funded project INCITE-DEM, the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, the Center for Ecology, Evolution and Environmental Changes, and the Competence Center on Participatory and Deliberative Democracy of the European Commission. This episode was produced by me, Roberto Falanga, with the collaboration of Eleonora Tolumello, who also handled live sound engineer, editing, and post-production. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at INCITE-DEM Citizens Reinventing Democracy for updates and additional content. Follow us on YouTube too.